You are. No.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All well, and that you all had a cracking weekend.
Yeah.
Let's mute everybody. It's not personal, but feel free to unmute yourselves at any point that you wish to give me an opportunity to have a drink. And we're going to get going. Can you see the screen that I've shared? Yes? Great. So let's get going. This week's shiur is dedicated by the Lobenstein family in memory of Elchanan ben Yosef Halevi, Zichrono Livracha. Thank you to the Lobenstein family for organizing that and for your regular participation in this shiur over many years. And may the Torah, which we learn today, provide an aliyah for his neshama. Parshat Shoftim commences with a series of mitzvot. And I'd like to start off just looking at the whole package deal of the mitzvot at the beginning of this week's Parsha, before we go on to look at what the Kli Yakar does with all of these mitzvot. Because the Parsha commences in source number 1, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sha'arecha, asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha. You should place judges and officers in all of your gates that the Lord your God gives to you, lishvatecha, for your tribes, v'shaftu et ha'am mishpat tzedek, and they should judge the people with correct, righteous judgment, justice. So we're a few weeks away from Moshe Rabbeinu passing away still, and he is presenting to us the model for how to set up a society built on Torah values and Torah law. And he goes on to give a few more details. Lo tateh mishpat. You're not allowed to pervert judgments, justice. Tateh is to lintot, it's to incline, to turn to one side. You can't do that. Lo takir panim. You can't recognize faces, meaning you can't show favor. V'lo tikach shochad. Nor can you take a bribe. Why? Because bribes have the potential to blind the eyes of the wise and to mumble the words of the righteous. What it means is that even if you know that the correct judgment is with Mr. A, and Mr. A comes along and he says, you know, I'd like to make a small donation to your yeshiva. It just so happens that I'm being judged by you at the moment, and you know that Mr. A is right anyway, so you think, what's the difference? No, you still can't do that. Bribes have the ability to distort your mind and your judgment. Therefore, bribes are completely forbidden. Even if you're a chacham, a wise person, even if you're a tzaddik, a righteous person, bribes can have an influence on you. Rather, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. Laman tichiyeh, so that you should live. V'yarashtai ha'aretz asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach, and you will inherit the land that the Lord your God gives you. Then we're told, Lo titah lecha asherah kol eitz hamizbach Hashem Elokecha. You're not allowed to plant an asherah tree, any tree. This is an idolatrous tree. By the altar of Hashem your God, asher taseh lach, which you make for yourself. V'lo takim lecha matzeva. You're also not allowed to make a stone monument. Asher saneh Hashem Elokecha. Yeah, Hashem hates those. And then we're just going to do the first pasuk of the next chapter, which is Lo tizbach l'Hashem Elokecha shar v'aseh sheyeh v'mum kol davara. You're not allowed to offer to Hashem your God an ox or a sheep which has a blemish, any bad thing. Why? Ki to'avat Hashem Elokecha hu, because it is an abomination to Hashem your God. So the parsha starts off talking to shoftim, shotrim, officers and judges, different ways where you have to keep on the straight and narrow when it comes to judging fairly without showing any favor or accepting any bribes. And then it seems to go off to unrelated matters about avodah zarah, an idolatrous tree next to a mizbeach, or having a stone monument, a matzeva, or having a blemish on an animal. It seems to be a almost random collection of laws. So let's see what the Kli Yakar does here in source number 3. He starts off with a very careful reading in the first set of these laws. Lo tateh mishpat, you shouldn't pervert justice. Lo takir panim, I made a mistake there, a bad mistake in the Kli Yakar. You should not recognize faces. V'lo tikach shochad, and you should not accept a bribe. And he says, Midelok amar v'lo takir panim b'vav. He says, note, it doesn't say v'lo takir panim, and you should not recognize faces, as opposed to v'amar, where it says v'lo tikach shochad, and you should not accept a bribe b'vav with a vav. Shma minna, we learn from here, shelo tateh v'lo takir kol echad milta ba'afei nafshei. Lo tateh and lo takir are each independent things. I'll show this in the pasuk for a moment to make it clear. Aval lo tikach shochad toladot shel lo takir panim. When it comes to accepting a bribe, that is a continuation, a consequence of the law of not recognizing faces. So I'm just going to explain this in the pasuk back in source number 1. Pay careful attention here. It says lo tateh mishpat. You should not pervert a judgment. Then it says, lo takir panim, you should not show favor. And then it says, v'lo tikach shochad, and you should not accept a bribe. Now, from the fact that this third phrase has a vav, and the second phrase does not commence with a vav, the Kli Yakar says we need to read the pasuk as follows. Lo tateh mishpat, that's one thing. Don't pervert judgment. Next, something completely new. Lo takir panim. Don't show favor. And then connect to that v'lo tikach shochad, and don't accept any bribes, because bribes can have an influence on chachamim and tzaddikim. So he's saying that these run into each other. Being makir panim, recognizing a face, and accepting a bribe is all one of the same thing, which is separate from the opening phrase. How does that all come together logically now? It is lefi because she'ha'ashirim nikra'u pnei ha'aretz. What does it mean, lo takir panim? Don't recognize faces. He comments on the fact that wealthy people are known as pnei haaretz, the faces of the land. Panim can mean the wealthy individuals. Kamosha pirish Rashi b'Parshat Miketz, as Rashi says in Parshat Miketz. And therefore, Ucheshe'amar lo takir panim hainu ha'ashirim, when it says not to recognize faces and show favor, that means not to favor the wealthy. Therefore, ukeshelo takiram, if you don't recognize wealth, as memela lo tikach shochad, then you're never going to accept a bribe. Ki hamakir pnei ha'ashirim, those who do show favor to the wealthy, why would you do that? It's because of the hope that maybe you'll get something out of this. Maybe you'll receive a bribe. That you're hoping that maybe you're going to get something out of this relationship. If not now, then in the future. And so he says, lo takir panim means don't show favor to the wealthy. And don't accept any bribes, because those two go together. Now, when he reaches his punchline at the end of source 4, you'll understand what he's getting at here, other than his usual complaints about the wealthy and their behavior. Now, in source number 4, the Kli Yakar is going to quote a fascinating midrash and try to tie it all together. Because we have 6 different mitzvot, which we saw in this opening series of mitzvot at the beginning of this week's Parsha. Lotita, etc. You can't plant a tree. This is the second set. Velotakim, you can't have a matzeva, a monument. Velotizbach, you can't have any blemished animal. The Midrash Amru, they said the following in the Midrash. Ki bekiseh shel Shlomo HaMelech, on the throne of Shlomo HaMelech, hayu sheish ma'alot. There were 6 steps on the way up to the throne of Shlomo HaMelech. Vayakatuv alechad, on step number 1, it says, lo tateh, you shouldn't pervert a mishpat. Ala sheni, on the second step, lo takir, you shouldn't recognize faces. Ala shlishi, on the third step, lo tikach, don't accept a bribe. Ala revi'i, on the fourth step, lo tita, don't plant an asherah, idolatrous tree. Ala chamishi, on the fifth one, lo takim, don't establish a stone monument. Ala shishi, on the sixth one, lo tizbach, don't have any animal with a mum. And so the opening 6 mitzvot in Parshat Shoftim, according to the Midrash, appear on the 6 steps of the throne of Shlomo HaMelech, which forces us to understand, based on this Midrash, that these are not 6 disconnected laws. And so the Kli Yakar is going to ask in the second paragraph of source 4, V'chol maskil yishtomem al hamareh. the intellectual reader will be astounded by this sight. Ma inyan lo tizbach v'lo takim v'lo tita lekiseh Shlomo asher uchan lemishpat. I can understand on Shlomo HaMelech's throne, it'll talk about not showing favor. It'll talk about having justice, not perverting justice. It'll talk about not accepting bribes. That makes sense. But planting an Asherah tree? What's that doing there? Having a blemish on an animal? What's that doing there? Having a stone monument? These are lords of Avodah Zarah and blemishes. What have they got to do with anything? And then he goes on to say, Umamar lo tizbach. That sixth one saying you can't offer up an animal which has a blemish. Which in your eyes might appear to be rachok, far-fetched, to place this on the throne of judgment. I actually want to explain that this is very closely connected. Like they said in the Gemara in Yevamot, Kishem shebeit din menukim hayu betzedek, kach hayu menukim mimum. The Gemara in Yevamot teaches us that just as a beit din needed to be clean when it came to their decisions and the clarity of their judgment, so too they needed to be clean in terms of having physical blemishes. Shne'emar, it says in Shir HaShirim, describing a Beit Din, Kolach yafer ayati umum ein bach, you're so beautiful, my beloved, and you don't have a blemish. So he says there's a connection here. Because just like animals aren't allowed to have blemishes, the Gemara tells us that judges aren't allowed to have physical blemishes either. And he says, V'yadua she'en lecha davar haba b'Kabbalah she'en lo smach min haTorah. He says, you should know that there is nothing in Kabbalah here. He doesn't mean Madonna Kabbalah. He means the received oral tradition. He says, there's nothing in the Midrashim which doesn't have a hook to hang on in the Torah. There's nothing just floating. Everything comes from somewhere. And so he asks, U'meheichan lamdu lomar ki min haTorah. So how did they find a source in the Torah to claim that the Sanhedrin needed to be clear of any physical blemishes? Where did that come from? Everybody agrees. Even somebody who generally doesn't learn lessons from the juxtaposition of different passages in the Torah, nevertheless, b'Mishneh Torah, in the book of Dvarim, Hakol darshi smuchim. In the book of Dvarim, everybody finds relevance in the juxtaposition of passages. V'im kein, and therefore, lemay nafkamina nismechu shisha lavin halalu. Why were these 6 opening mitzvot juxtaposed? Elalo malach, it comes to tell you, shekulam tloyin b'yoshev al kisei din. Each of these 6 laws are connected to somebody who sits on the throne of judgment. So we have 2 reasons to draw a connection between the prohibition against having a physical blemish on an animal and judgment. Reason number 1 is that they're taught together in a package deal of 6 mitzvot at the beginning of this week's Parsha. And reason number 2, as the Midrash explains, is that these are the 6 steps of the throne of Shlomo HaMelech, so they must all be connected. Now, what is that connection? Top of page 2. V'lo lichinam amra Torah she'yeh makom yeshivat Sanhedrin eitzel hamizbeach. He says it wasn't by coincidence, for no reason, that the Torah tells us the Sanhedrin needed to sit by the Mizbeach. Why do they have to be there? Why can't you have the Supreme Court somewhere else? It is so that we can learn from one to the other. V'chol haposel b'Mizbeach atzmo uvenikravim al gabav zeu adavar posel gam b'Sanhedrin. Something which becomes pasul, something which can't be used for the Mizbeach or can't be offered on the Mizbeach, is also inappropriate for the Sanhedrin. So we learn from the laws of the Mizbeach to the laws of the Sanhedrin. Lefi shezeh taloi bazeh, because they are interdependent. Why? Ki hamum moreh al kilkul hatzedek. He says that if somebody has an external physical blemish, it is a sign of some internal, let's call it more of a personality characteristic, behavioral malaise. L'chach samach pasuk lo tizbach lepasuk tzedek tzedek tirdof. And so the concept of not having a blemish on an animal is connected to judgment, because a judge who has such an external blemish, it's a sign that they've done something wrong. It's a slightly uncomfortable reading for those who don't like attributing reasons for why somebody may have a certain physical challenge or a physical disability which would qualify as a mum. Does that mean they've done something wrong? And if they're born that way, does that mean they've done something wrong? And from that angle, it's a bit of an uncomfortable reading. But his point is that there's a juxtaposition between the Mizbeach and the judge, because external blemishes reflect internal challenges. And then he goes on to the other mitzvot. How are they connected? Just as the Mizbeach needed to be made of many stones, and it couldn't just be made of one big lump of stone. Kacha Sanhedrin, we learn the same thing for the Sanhedrin. Trichin liot rabin, you need to have many members of the Sanhedrin. It can't be a one-man show. And all of this is building up to the point he really wants to make. And then he goes on to say, you can't plant an Asherah tree. Darshu, they taught in the Gemara in Sanhedrin 7b, Kol ha'ma'amid dayan she'eno hagun, anybody who appoints an inappropriate judge, ki'ilu notea Asherah, it's as if you've planted an idolatrous tree. Uvimkom Talmid Chacham, and if you appointed an inappropriate judge instead of a suitable Talmid Chacham, ki'ilu nato eitzam mizbach Hashem, it's as if you've planted this idolatrous tree next to Hashem's Mizbeach. Now you might ask, what's one got to do with the other? One's an idolatrous tree, the other is an appointment of judges in a judicial system. Well, we already know this morning that the two are juxtaposed in the Torah, they come together. And what's the ontological connection? He says, this is a great warning against haughtiness and arrogance. We also learn this from the Mizbeach. Hashem didn't want a silver Mizbeach, a golden Mizbeach. Hashem wanted a Mizbeach made of earth, Hamoreh al Geder Anava, which is an expression of Anava, an expression of humility, meaning we need humble judges, not judges who put on a nice external show. And I've cut this right down. He wrote at far greater length about a number of these areas, but all of this was in order to build up to his punchline. Just a moment, I'm going to disable annotation, which I should always remember to do before the shiur commences. And I'm just gonna reshare this screen, so it'll just be clean again. Here we go. And let's get to his punchline. And then he says, V'doreinu, in our generation, Kama asherot notim v'chol ir va'ir, how many idolatrous trees are planted in every single city? Meaning, how bad is the religious judicial leadership of our time? There are so many inappropriate judges in our cities. Lo yevakru bein makom tamid chacham or lo, and there's no discerning about whether it's instead of a tamid chacham or not instead of a tamid chacham. Gan kiyeh biro tamid chacham mufla b'torah v'chasidut. Even if there's someone in a city who's a Talmid Chacham, who's just mufla, amazing in Torah and piety, Kol chachmato lo amdalo, his learning and Torah is just worthless. Ki al kol panim kol echad yivchar lo bikrovo. Who gets appointed to be judges in cases? People are choosing their relatives. Oba mechutano, or the mechutim gets appointed to be a judge. This is a claim of major nepotism in the appointment of dayanim in every city. Asher yodeh bo shu yachanif lo, because you know that these people will flatter you. Or yitnaged lesono, he'll be against someone who you hate. Or pirtzah zo bimlo'ah b'rabat b'nei ami. And this pirtzah, this breach is just full blown with among so many people. This is a major, major criticism. He's basically criticizing the Beit Din of every single town, saying that it's filled with inappropriate judges who've been appointed by nepotism. These are idolatrous trees in every single city. And the good news is he also says, Asher lichvod zera Abraham eit lekatzer. He says, I'm not really going to speak about this at length out of honor for the offspring of Abraham Avinu. So this is his brief version of having a go at the religious leadership at the time. Umikol makom, nevertheless, Allah biyadi bi'ur yakar bismichut shisha lavin elu. He says, putting aside my criticism of the nepotism and corruption of the appointment of Dayanim in every city at this time, we still have a lovely explanation for the juxtaposition of these 6 negative commandments at the beginning of Parshat Shoftim. So he's approaching the end of his commentary at the Torah. He's only got a few chances left to attack the leadership of the time, and he uses this one well. Let's move on to a next section in the Parsha, which describes what to do if you don't know what to do. And again, we're going to need a few psukim to paint the context and the picture here. Before we're going to look at the surprising Rashi and the Kli Yakar's fairly modern or even postmodern approach to these psukim. Here's what it says in source number 5. Ki yipaleh mimcha davar lamishpat. When something is yipaleh, when it's wondrous, when it's beyond you, something in judgment. Bein dam ledam, bein din ledin, or bein nega lenega, whether it's a matter of dispute about different types of blood, or different areas of judgment, or different types of afflictions, divrei ribot b'sha'arecha, if there are quarrels in your gates. What should you do? You have a halachic debate, a halachic argument, a halachic question. Moshe Rabbeinu is no longer around. Where do you go? You should get up and go to the place that Hashem your God shall choose. This is one of the 21 occasions that this phrase appears in the book of Dvarim, the place that Hashem will choose, a reference to the Beit HaMikdash. Uvata el ha-Kohanim haLeviyim. You should go to the Kohanim from the tribe of Levi. Ve'el ha-Shofet asher yeh b'yamim hahem, and to the judge who will be at that time. V'darashta, investigate. V'gidu lecha et davar ha-mishpat, and they will tell you what to do. V'asita al pi hadavar asher yagidu lecha min hamakom hahu asher yivchar Hashem. You should do what they tell you to do from that place that Hashem has commanded. And make sure you keep everything that they tell you. And then this message is repeated. According to the Torah that they teach you. And the judgments that they give you, you have to follow what they tell you to do. Do not turn from that which they tell you, right or left. So this is somewhat of a repeated point which Moshe Rabbeinu makes to us, but he's telling us when you come to Israel and you don't know what to do, you have to go to the Kohanim or the judge who is there at that time in the place that Hashem has chosen. You have to do what they tell you to do. You have to make sure you're going to do what they're going to do. Do what they tell you to do and don't veer from what they tell you to do, right or left. Now, what's this phrase at the end? Right or left? Rashi is going to make a comment here, which is going to create much discussion amongst those who come after Rashi. Source number 6, you're not allowed to turn right or left from that, which the Torah giants of the generation tell you, yamin or small. Rashi says, afilu omer lecha al yamin shehu small, v'al small shehu yamin. Even if the halakhic ruling you receive is that right is left, or that left is right, especially if he tells you that right is right and left is left, you have to listen. What's going on in this Rashi? Rashi says the Torah is telling us that you have to follow that which Chazal tell us, and that the Torah giants of the generation tell you, even if they tell you that right is left and left is right, you have to listen to them. How are we supposed to understand this? There are numerous ways of understanding it. There's the Ramban and Nachmanides way of understanding this, which we saw a few years ago, which is more or less saying that even if you think that they're wrong, and even if you think that they're saying that right is left and left is right, that they've got everything completely wrong, actually they're right and you're wrong. You know, don't think that you know better. But the Kli Yakar in source number 7 has a different approach to this. And he says as follows, because it's an uncomfortable concept saying, listen to what they say. Even, to put this in simple words, is saying you have to follow the Torah giants of the generation, even if they are objectively wrong. Even if they say that right is left and left is right. How can that be? Source number 7, let's look at the Kli Yakar approach. Lo tasur min hadavar sheyagidu lecha yamin u'smol, do not veer from what they tell you, right or left. Pirush Rashi explains, Afilo malachal min al yamin shu smol, etc., even if he tells you that right is left. Now, first of all, he wants to know where Rashi gets this from. Nireh, it appears, shedigdek zeh, Rashi got this from a careful reading. Midelo ka'amar, the pasuk doesn't say, Lo tasur yamin usmol min hadavar, don't turn right or left for the matter. However, what the pasuk does say is, Amar, from the fact it says, Yamin usmol achar asher yagidu lecha, that which they tell you. So the pasuk says, don't veer from that which they tell you, right or left. So there's a focus on that which they tell you, meaning their subjective reading, that which comes from them. Shma mina shahachi ka'amar, this is what it means. Af al pi, and this is a difficult statement to read, but we'll read it. Even though shekafi ha'emet, the truth is, eino yamin usmol zulat ma shehem yagidu lecha shehu yamin usmol. Even though the truth isn't what they're saying. Uvetam zenit kashu ha'mefarshim. Based on this, the Mefarshim had such difficulty. V'natnu ta'amim rabim, and so many reasons have been given for this. Is the Torah really telling us to follow that the Torah giants of the generation tell us, even if they are completely wrong? Is that what the Torah is telling us to do? To follow something which is not emet, which is not true. And the Kli Yakar explains it as follows. Uchafi emet, in truth, he says, all the Rishonim, all the Mefarshim, they really struggled on this. He says it's actually quite straightforward. I've got no problem here at all. Because our sages have already told us in the Gemara in Chagiga, page 3b, that somebody who's exposed to the world of halacha may come along and make the following claim. Shema Yomar Adam. Perhaps someone will say, Hoil v'halalu mitaharin v'halalu mitamin. There's a halachic debate. Some people say it's tameh, and some people say it's tahor. Halalu osrin v'halalu mitirin. Some people say it's forbidden, and some people say it's okay. Some people will say, come on, I've been attending halacha shiurim for a while, and there's always another opinion. This is all nonsense. There's always someone who's going to argue. It's just arguments about absolutely everything. Hey, the Gemara says. Someone will ask, how can I possibly learn Torah? Where's the objective divine truth in all of this? Because absolutely everything is debated and debatable. Talmud Lomar, no, we're told in Kohelet, Nitnu Miro Echad, they're all taught from one shepherd. Kulan Kel Echad Natnan, we received all of them from Hashem. So if somebody says, how can this be the case? There are so many arguments and differences of opinion. You say it all comes from Hashem. And the Kli Yakar asks, V'kashena, have we actually answered the question? Halo hadra kushtia de duchta. You still have the question. The question has returned to where it came from. But sof, at the end of the day, we still need to ask the question. Heach ani lomed Torah, how can I learn Torah? How can I have faith in the halachic system is the real question here, which is a very true question for many people, especially those who are not literate in the halachic system, whose best halachic argument is, well, that rabbi says it's okay, or that shul does it, but people who don't really know about the development of halacha and the way halacha works, and they lack faith in the halachic system. Well, how are you supposed to make sense of this? Ela bi'or hadavar, those are my words, by the way, not his. The Kli Yakar comes along and says as follows. This is how you're supposed to explain it too. Shebechol davar tuma v'tahara, he says. For every matter of ritual purity and impurity, yesh kama panim lataharo, v'chama panim latamo. There are numerous justified and true reasons to say that it is pure, and numerous angles and reasons to say that it's tameh. V'im ha-Torah taharato, and if the halacha, if the Torah says that this is pure, It's because the number of reasons to say that this is tahor, pure, is greater than the number of reasons to say that it is impure. And vice versa. If something is treif as opposed to kosher, it's because the number of reasons to say it is treif is greater than the number of reasons to say that it's kosher. It's the same thing with something which is prohibited and allowed. The chasher and pasul, something which can be used and something which can't be used. For this reason, our sages told us in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, page 17a, you don't appoint somebody to be a member of the Sanhedrin until he's able to argue why biblically a sheretz, a creepy crawly, is kosher. Only if you can successfully argue why something treif should be kosher, something glatt treif should be kosher, then are you able to join the Sanhedrin. So the Kli Yakar is being rather postmodern here. If our basic assumption when we come to this question is that there is an objective truth, either it's right or it's left. It's either one or the other. So what's this mess going on in this halachic system? And if they tell you right and it's actually left, what's going on here? What the Kli Yakar is bringing us into is the postmodern world where the concept of an objective truth isn't really what's running the show. And he's saying that you can look at something from different angles and there can be multiple truths about one reality. And if the halacha is that something is kosher as opposed to treif, or forbidden as opposed to allowed, or kasher as opposed to pasul, or whatever it happens to be, it's because there are more reasons to say that it goes one way as opposed to the other. But it doesn't mean that one couldn't, in theory, put forward an argument to say the opposite. This is something which is very important for us to remember. The fact that somebody can make a halachic argument about something does not mean that they are halachically correct. Because you can make a halachic argument to explain why a sheretz is kosher, and therefore you pass your qualification exam to become a member of the Sanhedrin, but it doesn't mean that a sheretz is kosher. And sometimes in our time we see halachic articles or shiurim and people making halachic arguments, and you think, ooh, they made a halachic argument. But the fact that you can make a halachic argument doesn't mean you reach the correct halachic end point. But let's continue on this journey with the Kli Yakar. V'ta'amah shel davar, the reason is as follows. She'im lefanin tzrichim lahora'at sha'ah. Why does it have to be this way? Why do we need the system to be so complex? Can't we just have black and white? He says no. Because sometimes you will need a hora'at sha'ah, a temporary emergency measure. Lifsok neged haTorah. Sometimes you need to paskin against the accepted halacha, mishum, because of, like it says in Tehillim, Eit lasot laHashem heferu toratecha. It is a time to do something for Hashem. Therefore, heferu toratecha. You go against the Torah, meaning there are times where you need, in extenuating circumstances, to do the opposite of what the acceptable thing to do is. As yuchal hachacham or navi, under such circumstances, the chacham or the prophet will be able litzaref lesvarat eit lasot laHashem, together with the argument of eit lasot laHashem, the fact that sometimes you have to act for Hashem in an emergency or desperate extenuating circumstances. It's not just going to be a free-for-all, but together with that emergency and urgent requirement, they'll be able to attach otan mi'ut svarot, the minority logical thoughts, shekvar nidchu machamat harov, which have been pushed aside because of the majority, v'leilech achar hamiyut, and in those circumstances, you follow the minority. So you can have a standard halachic practice, which is to do X. There is a minority opinion which argues you should do Y. And in day-to-day lives, Y is irrelevant. And don't talk about Y and leave Y to the side. But Y has a role to play in the halachic system because a time may come where circumstances demand us to say that under these circumstances, we're going to follow Y as opposed to X. And it's not just black and white, you're either right or wrong, halachically correct or halachically wrong. There's halachically advisable based on the majority of opinions, and there's the halachic minority opinion, which will pull out of the hat if we really, really have to. What happens if the chacham or the navi can't argue with themselves? Isn't able to show another way of understanding things, only knows the black and white halacha? As le'olam lo yitaru afilu b'hora'at sha'a, what will happen is that even when you are stuck, even in desperate situations, their hands will be tied because they will not be aware of the minority views, and they'll lack the halachic creativity to be able to view things from different angles, which under normal circumstances are irrelevant, but under extreme circumstances become the call of the hour. Ki natan Hashem koach gam lebeitim shelamata lasot svarot lechan ulechan. Hashem gave our Beit Din down here, not only in Shamayim, but Hashem empowered us with a tremendous responsibility, but also tremendous power to view things in different ways. And therefore he says, Chazal said beautifully in the Gemara in Chagigah, page 3b, the continuation of the Gemara from before. And it says, make your ears like a funnel. It says, pay attention and open your heart. Acquire a heart which will listen to both sides of an argument. You might say to yourself, just tell me what to do. Just tell me what the halacha is. I'm in my kitchen. Just tell me what to do. It's nice that there are other opinions. It's nice there are other ways of looking at things. I don't need to know that. Just tell me what to do. The Gemara says we have to open our ears like funnels and acquire a heart which wants to absorb all sides of the debate. Ki chafi hayamet, because in truth, kol adam tzarich lekol hasvarot. We each need to access all the opinions. Because you can't be a member of the Sanhedrin. This is assuming that everybody aspires to be a member of the Sanhedrin. You can't be a member of the Sanhedrin until you have a control of all the ways of looking at something. Let's get back to our Parsha. Based on all of this, we have to listen to the Torah sages, even if what they're telling you sounds like the complete opposite of the right answer. Even if it is not the normal truth, but they're presenting a different truth, because according to some opinions, left is right and right is left. Normally we don't say that. In extreme situations we have to. And this is a very correct way. So just to return to where we were in the bigger picture, Moshe warns us when we come to Israel, what we have to do is to go to the place that Hashem will choose, listen to the Kohanim or the Shofet, the leader who will be there at that time. We have to do what they tell us to do. We have to be careful to keep that which they tell us to do. We're not allowed to go against that which they tell us to do, right or left. Rashi says, even if they tell you that right is left and left is right, you have to listen to them, which seems to suggest that even if you get it wrong, you have to follow them. Ramban's approach, like we mentioned, is that even if you think they've got it wrong, have faith that they've got it right. What the Kli Yakar presents is more of a postmodern approach to things, whereby we're not dealing with an objective truth, but we are dealing with multiple truths, and the halachic system has an inbuilt flexibility which allows us to sometimes say the opposite of that which we normally say to deal with extenuating circumstances. And if you don't have the depth of the halachic knowledge or the breadth of the halachic knowledge to be aware of other opinions, the minority opinions, which normally we don't hold like, then you're going to be halachically stifled to deal with difficult and challenging situations. Moving on to something else. You know, these Kohanim, they work so hard for us, at least in theory when they were supposed to be in charge. They should get something. And they do get something. In source number 8. V'zeh yeh mishpat haKohanim me'et ha'am. This should be the law for the Kohanim from the people, me'et zivchei hazevach, from the offerings which are offered, imshor imser, whether it's an ox or a sheep. V'natan laKohen, what's the Kohen? The Kohen gets 3 things. Hazroa, v'halachayim, v'hakeva. he gets the arm. Animals don't have arms. So he gets the forearm, whatever that's called, of the animal, and the l'chaim, and the cheek, and the keva, and the stomach of the animal. Source number 9. What's going on here? He says, Rav hamafarshim chatrudim so derech l'smichut parsha zo leparsha shel mala. Because we're in the book of Dvarim, as we've mentioned before, you can always start a Dvar Torah by asking, what's this got to do with the previous passage? And he says lots of people have tried to connect this to the laws of the king and judges. And he says, until I've come along, no one's done a good enough job. For example, Ayan Besifrei Maharia Barbanel, look at the Barbanel, the Barbanel brought loads of opinions, and he says no one yet has really explained the correct explanation for the context of this law of the parts of the animal which the Kohen receives. But Omer Ani, I want to explain it as follows. Lefish and Emar, because it says in the book of Shmuel, Zeh Mishpat HaMelech. This is the Mishpat HaMelech, the law of the king, so not of the Kohen. This is the law of the king, Asher Yimnoch Aleichem, who rules over you. And in that context, we're told, a king can take your fields, a king can take your vineyards. When it shows that the king rules over you, this is a hint to what we've already learned in the Torah about the king, the melech. As it says, alecha melech. You should put a king over you. The bottom line is, when it comes to a king, a king can control your body, and how much more so your money. In other words, when it comes to the way a king rules over you, a king can by force, as we know from the book of Shmuel, which connects us back to the Torah, a king can by force come along and take whatever he wants. That's what a king can do. Al kain smach leparshat hamelech, juxtaposed to the parsha of the king, shemishpateu likach hakol bezroa, that a king can take everything by force. Aval mishpat hakohanim eino ken. We're told about the kohanim for contrast. Elaschar sherutohu notel, when the kohen takes his portions from the animals, the kohen is not being a king taking taxes for no reason whatsoever. The Kohen is receiving his payment. He provides you a service, and in exchange for his service, he receives certain things. Kamosh Ne'amar, as it says, La'amod, the Kohen is there to stand for you, L'sharet, to serve for you. V'lo kamosh Amar Korach, as opposed to what Korach claimed, Shehem lochin derech srara, that the Kohen would just take things by force. Kemelech hamvuah b'mkomo, like a king, as explained there. And therefore, that's one explanation. Why are the laws of the gifts for the Kohen in this week's Parsha, where they appear, to show that as opposed to the king who can take things by force, a Kohen is just receiving the payment that they deserve. And maybe it's also putting a caveat in the law. A king can take whatever he likes, but don't touch that which belongs to the Kohanim. And he's just going to finish off this segment with I won't call it cute. You can decide if it's cute or if it's true or if it's nice or if it's meaningful. He finishes off with a nice connection here. The Kohen gets 3 things. V'tam hazroa v'halechayim v'hakeva. The Kohen gets the, whatever animals have, arms, and the cheek and the stomach. Karov lishmoa, why these 3 things? Because these reflect the 3 things that the Kohen does for you. Shehazroa, what does the Kohen do with his arms? Schar nisyot kapav, it's for lifting up his hands to bless you with birkat kohanim. So because the Kohen does birkat kohanim with his hands, he gets that part of the animal. The halachayim, the cheeks, schar birkat kohanim befeh, that's because of the oral recitation of the priestly blessing, and therefore you get the cheeks because of what the Kohen does with his mouth. V'hakeva, what does the Kohen do for you with his stomach? Ki bizchuto, what a bracha this is going to be. You get a special bracha in the merit of the Kohen. Yishlach Hashem et bracha, Hashem sends the bracha, she'ochel kima u'mitbarech b'me'av, you eat just a little bit and you feel full. For some people, that comes naturally to them. They have the bracha from Hashem that they don't eat very much and they feel full. For those of us who don't have that bracha naturally, where you don't necessarily feel full, even after you've eaten a lot, it's an incredible bracha if you're able to receive it. And the channel of that bracha comes through the Kohanim. The Kohanim have the ability to give us a bracha for our stomachs, that we can feel full even after eating just a little bit. So the Kohen blesses us with his hands, he blesses us with his mouth, and he blesses our stomachs. That's the part of the animal that the Kohen receives. I'd now like to move on to something completely different in the Parsha. Something which appears in the middle of nowhere, both in the context of what it's describing and in the context of this week's Parsha. Because, you know, next week's Parsha is going to be Ki Teitzei, La Milchama, when you go out to war. And the words Ki Teitzei, La Milchama appear in this week's Parsha as well. And there's a whole section of the Torah dealing with going out to war. And in the middle of that section, we have source number 10. Ki yimatzeh chalal ba'adama, when you find a slain individual in the ground. Asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha l'rishta, that Hashem your God gives you in the land that Hashem your God has given to you to possess. Nofel basadeh, this slain individual fallen in the field. V'lo noda mi hikau, nobody knows who killed this individual. This just appears in the middle of the laws of law. What happens if you find a body in the field? The Abar Ben-El in source number 11 tries to provide some kind of context, which the Kli Yakar is not going to appreciate so much. Ki yimatzeh chalal ba'adama, etc. At Sof HaSeder, this entire section, says the Abar Ben-El, Acharei she'ezir belimud hadvarim hamitachim lemelachim elashoftim b'inyanei hamilchamot. You see, the Torah has just told us about kings and about judges in the context of war. We're dealing with kings and judges. What do judges have to deal with? Tzivah Parsha Hazot, we now have this Parsha. Balamad din egla arufa, it teaches us the law of the egla arufa, the decapitated calf, which is what happens as part of the process. Shahaya mityaches lekohanim lalviyim elashoftim asher bebeit din hagadol, which would relate to the Kohanim of the tribe of Levi and the judges of the Beit Din Hagadol, or the Shoftim Harishonim Asher B'Sharim, and those first judges in the gates. So, according to Abar Ben-El, why in the middle of the rules of kings and judges and war do we have the rules, the halachot of the Egla Arufah, of this body which is found in the field? Because that's also something which is brought to the judges. I'm putting this in a tone that the Kli Yakar wants us to read it, which is that it's not the strongest connection in the world. That is the uniting theme for all the mitzvot in this section. Kololot kafi, mash hizkarati, which are all included in what I've explained. These are things that you bring to judges. Kli Yakar, source number 12. Etc. When you find a body slain in the field, Iksha Mahari Abar Ben-El al Parsha Zo. The Abar Ben-El was challenged by this Parsha. She'ein kan mekoma, because it just doesn't belong here. Bein arba parshiot hamedabrot me'inyan milchama, in the context of 4 sections dealing with war. V'natan harav tam chalush bedavar, the Abar Ben-El gave a weak reason. We saw his reason, which was that this is also something which you bring to the judges. The Kli Yakar says that's a weak reason. Gam shar ha'mefarshim hanigashim lefaresh hasmichut b'shinoyim t'chukim. He says also everyone else who tries to explain it has really far-fetched and forced ways of trying to explain this. So the Kli Yakar says, don't worry, I'll help you out. Va'ata, and now, sa na einecha ure'eh, lift up your eyes and see. We've seen this phrase quite a few times in the Kli Yakar when he clearly is going to enjoy what he's about to tell us now. Masha Amru Chazal, pay attention, he says, to what the Gemara says in Sotah, page 46a. Tanya, it's taught in a Braita. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Shaul, he said as follows. Mipnei ma amra Torah have egla arufa. Why does the Torah tell you to bring a calf as part of this process? What is the significance of a calf? Yes, an eglah is a calf, and davka a calf. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Torah Hashem tells us, Tavo ha'eglah, let this calf come along, shelo asta peirot, which has not yet made fruit. Meaning this animal which hasn't yet had children, or hasn't even lived to its full potential. The calf comes along as part of this process. V'ta'aref, and it should be decapitated b'makom she'eno oseh peirot, in a place which doesn't make fruit, because you're out there in the wilderness between these two places. U'techaper al zeh shelo hinichuhu lasot peirot, and this is all atonement for the person where he was unable to make fruit. This is all about potential being cut short. When you find this body lying there in the field, it is about unfulfilled potential. And therefore we bring the eglah with its own unfulfilled potential, by the end of the process certainly, in a place of unfulfilled potential to atone for the unfulfilled potential of this slain individual. The Gemara says, what do you mean unfulfilled potential? If we're talking about the slain individual's potential to reproduce. Hachanami, what about the halacha of a saris, someone who's physically unable to reproduce? Or v'azaken, what if the person's too old to reproduce? You can no longer say that there's unfulfilled potential for this person to be fruitful in that way. And it says, lo arifna, for those cases, won't you go through this process? Ela amitzvot. When the Torah talks about the unfulfilled potential of the individual in the field, it's not talking about the unfulfilled potential of having children. It's talking about the unfulfilled potential of fulfilling mitzvot. So when we come along out into the field and you find this person lying there, completely anonymous, nobody knows who they are, what their story is, who killed them, what we're supposed to be atoning for, the Gemara is telling us, and the Torah is telling us through this process, is the unfulfilled potential, what this person could have brought to the world and done for the world still with the days that they had left. Now, what's that got to do with the context of the Parsha? Of Parsha Shelifnei Zenemar, in the preceding Parsha we're told, Ki mimeno tochal, in the context of going to war, we're told about how we have to approach certain trees. And we're told about fruit-producing trees, that those trees are for you to eat from. V'atolo tichrot, you're not allowed to cut down a fruit-producing tree. Rak eitz asher teda ki lo eitz machal hu, you're only allowed to cut down a tree which you know that is not a fruit-producing tree. V'amru chazal b'masechet Ta'anit, our sages told us in the Gemara in Ta'anit, page 7a, Im talmid chacham hagon hu mimenu tochal. What do we learn from the fact that you're not allowed to cut down a fruit-producing tree? We learn that you're supposed to eat from a talmid chacham who is a reasonable, fair individual. V'atolo tichrot, don't cut down that kind of talmid chacham. Rak eitz asher teda ki lo eitz ma'achal hu. But if you have a tree which is not a fruit-producing tree, meaning a talmid chacham she'eino hagun, a talmid chacham who doesn't behave appropriately, that's the type of talmid chacham which needs to be cut down. So just to organize where we are. We have our section of the body laying in the field, that you bring along an eglah arufa. The Kli Yakar says that the theme there is unfulfilled potential. Just before this, in the laws of war, we have the laws of certain trees, and you're not allowed to cut down fruit trees, which is good because that's going to connect us to unfulfilled potential. And he says the concept of cutting down fruit trees, by the way, teaches us not to cut down genuine Talmidei Chachamim, as opposed to following those other guys where they may look like lovely, luscious trees, but they are not Hagunim, they are entirely inappropriate for you to follow. So the Kli Yakar says, after all these Mefarshim have tried so hard to explain the context of this law, v'imkein therefore, kol maskil yireh be'ein sichlo, any intellectual individual will just be able to note, it just explains itself. There's an obvious connection between these two parshiot, why they appear juxtaposed. Either way you read the Gemara. Im tam ha'egla arufa, if the reason for the parsha of the egla arufa, al shelo hanichu lasot peirot b'pirya uraviya, if it's about this person's inability to have children, now that they are no longer alive. Shapir nismach ala parsha hakodemet. Well, that's a beautiful continuation of the previous parsha. Hamakbedet al eitz oseh pri, which talks about a tree producing fruit. Shelo lichrot oto, don't cut it down prematurely. Well, mali pri adama. You know, there's a natural connection between the fruit of man and the fruit of the earth. Mishpat echad lahem, same thing for both of them. Shne'emar, as it says, ki adam eitz hasadehu, for the person is a tree of the field. So he says, if the concern with this individual in the field is that they can no longer reproduce, well, that's a natural connection to the previous parsha, the previous section in the parsha, which is talking about a tree which can no longer produce because you've cut it down. And if the point here isn't reproduction, but the ability to have the spiritual fruit of mitzvot, the conclusion of the Gemara, well, that's the theme of the previous parsha. Because what does it mean, don't cut down a fruit tree? Don't cut down a Talmid Chacham who makes Eitz Chayim, the true Torah of life. And he says, and therefore, V'tama ani al kol ha-mefarshim. He says, I'm just amazed at all the mefarshim. Shedavar pashut kazeh, such a simple thing. Yene'elam mineged eineihem, they just couldn't see. He says it's just so obvious, the connection is obvious. That's why this halacha is here. And he says, and don't think this is a far-fetched comparison. If you think, trees, people, tzaddik, fruit, come on. When the sages told us, when our sages draw a connection between a fruit-producing tree and a Torah sage, he says this is not going against the pshat. Don't think I'm a person of pshat. A tree is a tree and a Talmid Chacham is a Talmid Chacham. He says, no, this doesn't go against the pshat. It's coming to explain. Why does the Torah care so much about a fruit-producing tree? It's a tree. Who cares about a tree? Why does the Torah care about the tree? We're supposed to draw a logical conclusion for ourselves. To learn from this for a person. If we're supposed to be so sensitive to the potential of a tree, how much more so should we be sensitive to the spiritual potential of a human being? Ki adam eitz hasadehu, because a person is compared to a tree of the field, or sepri tzadik v'temach tzedakah, and a person is just so fruitful with righteousness and bringing forth charity and righteousness. If the Torah cares so much about a fruit tree which doesn't have intellect, utvuna, or discerning, kal v'chomer al pri hatzadik hashalem, how much more so should we pay attention to individuals? What it's saying, sometimes you have people where in their great love for the environment and their great love for trees, sometimes the life of the tree will take precedence over the life of the human being. What it's telling us is that the Torah wants us to know that if the Torah cares so much about the tree, if the Torah cares so much about something which doesn't live on our level, how much more so should we be sensitive to the human beings, especially human beings who are so incredibly fruitful and productive and have so much to give to this world. And therefore, that's why the section of cutting down a fruit tree automatically takes us to that individual lying in the field. Somebody without a name, without a known history. Nobody knows what happened to them. Nobody knows how they died. The Torah wants to teach us to show sensitivity to this individual. If we can be sensitive to a tree that doesn't have a name, if we could be sensitive to a tree that never had a life, if we could be sensitive to a tree which isn't a human being, how much more so when we discover a person in the field, we should be sensitive to them and their needs and the fruit that they could have produced in their lifetime. That's the end of the Kli Yakar for today. And as Agi, I understand, has just pointed out, this is the final shiur for now, where Agi is going to be joining us from our time zone. So Agi, we look forward to you joining us from a different time zone. You know, middle of the night on Sunday night shouldn't be a problem for you at all. Or maybe we're just all going to move to your time zone, and we're all going to move to Eretz Yisrael together with you. For the benefit of everyone right here, just at the beginning of the shiur, I just want to once again thank the Lobenstein family for dedicating today's shiur, which was in memory of Elchanan ben Yosef Halevi, Zichrono Livracha. So thank you again to the Lobenstein family. That's it for today.
Yasher koach, yasher
Thank
koach.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nesia tova.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very, very
Thanks,
soon.
Rabbi Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Gone.
Audio on, off.